I was 53 years old the autumn Calvin Reese rode back into Harlan's Ford, and I had been a deputy in that town long enough to know when a man was trying not to be noticed. He came in off the Keeler Road at dusk, his horse a roan gelding I didn't recognize, his coat collar up against the October wind, his hat brim low. He tied up at the post outside Greer's feed store and went straight to the land office before it closed. Didn't stop at the saloon. Didn't ask after anybody by name. Paid for a room at the Alcott boarding house without knowing, or maybe knowing exactly, whose name was above the door. I noticed him because it was my job to notice. And because I had known Calvin Reese since we were boys cutting fence line together on his father's property south of town, and a man doesn't forget a walk like that. The particular way Calvin set his shoulders when he was carrying something he hadn't figured out how to put down yet. I let him have the night. In the morning I went to find him. He was sitting on the step outside the boarding house with a tin cup of coffee, looking out at the street like he was reading something written in the dust that nobody else could see. He'd shaved. His hair was more gray than brown now, cut close. The lines around his eyes were deep. He looked like 20 years of weather, which was exactly what he was. "DeLand," he said when I got close enough. "Calvin." He looked at me for a moment. "You going to tell me to move along?" "Haven't decided yet," I said, and sat down on the step beside him. That was how it started. The thing I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, how close it came to going the other way. How easy it would have been for Calvin to settle his father's estate, sign the papers, and ride back out the Keeler Road without any of it coming to light. How the whole story might have stayed buried in a trunk in a dead man's back room, and two people might have gone to their graves believing a lie. But that isn't what happened. Calvin's father, Eustace Reese, had died the previous March. Left the property to Calvin, 40 acres of rocky range south of town that hadn't been properly worked in a decade, 2 horses, a wagon, and a set of debts that needed sorting before the land could be sold. Calvin had been somewhere in Wyoming when the letter from the bank reached him. He'd taken his time getting back. "Why so long?" I asked him that first morning. He was quiet for a moment, turned the tin cup in his hands. "Had some things to settle in my head first," he said. "Thought I might just send a letter back to the bank and have them handle it. Figured I could do the whole thing without coming in person." "But you didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Nora Alcott had been Nora Whitfield when Calvin left Harlan's Ford in the spring of 1861. She was 22 years old then, the daughter of a school teacher, with dark hair and a manner that was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface, with a good deal of current underneath. Calvin had courted her for 2 years. Everybody in town expected they'd marry before the war pulled the young men away. They hadn't quite gotten there. He'd left without a formal proposal, but with an understanding between them that was as clear as anything written on paper, and a promise to write. He had written. That much I knew, because Calvin told me so that first morning, and I believed him, because I had known Calvin Reese a long time and he was not a man who lied. "I wrote her every month for the first 3 years," he said, "then every 6 weeks or so. Then," he stopped, set the cup down on the step beside him. "Then the letters stopped coming back." "She stopped writing." "She stopped writing," he said. "I figured," he picked a thread off his coat sleeve. "I figured she'd found somebody else. I couldn't blame her. A woman can't wait forever on a man who might not come back." "She never found anybody else," I said. He went very still. "Nora Whitfield is Nora Alcott now because she inherited the boarding house from her aunt, not because she married an Alcott," I said. "She's been running this place for 11 years. She never married." Calvin looked at me for a long time. The morning light was coming up pale and cold over the roof lines, and somewhere down the street a horse was being shod, the ring of iron on iron carrying clean and sharp through the thin air. "Why," he said, the word came out rough. "That's a question you'd have to ask her," I said. He looked back out at the street. His jaw was tight. I watched him work through some equation that had no clean answer, that had been sitting wrong for 20 years and still wouldn't come out right. I wrote to her for 8 years, he said finally, and then the letters stopped coming back and I thought I understood what that meant. He shook his head. Maybe I should have come back sooner to make sure. Maybe, I said, but you're here now. He wasn't ready to see her. I understood that. Nora ran the boarding house where he was staying, which meant he was going to see her whether he was ready or not, but I understood what he meant. He wasn't ready to stand in front of her and have the conversation that needed having. So he spent the first 3 days in Harlan's Ford doing the thing he'd come to do. He went to the bank, talked to the land agent, sorted through his father's papers, had a surveyor walk the south acreage with him. He was methodical and quiet, and he did the work that needed doing. And in the evenings he sat in the dining room of the boarding house and ate whatever was put in front of him without looking up much. And Nora moved around the edges of the room with the same composed efficiency I had watched her maintain for years. And I sat at my usual corner table and watched them not look at each other and thought, this is the most painful thing I have ever witnessed from a chair. They spoke on the second evening. I was there, it was brief. Nora had come to clear the table after supper, and Calvin had stayed in his seat a beat too long, which was the only thing that told me it was deliberate. She reached past him for the bread plate and he said quietly, Nora. She stopped. Just stopped, with the plate in her hand and looked at him. And I watched 20 years move across her face in about 3 seconds, not dramatically, not with any kind of breaking down, just a slow, complicated wash of something I couldn't fully name. And then she drew it back in, and her expression settled into something careful and neutral. Mr. Reese, she said, I hope everything's been comfortable. It has, he said, thank you. She nodded, she took the bread plate, she walked back to the kitchen. Calvin sat at the empty table for a long time after that, looking at the place she'd been standing. I'd known Nora Alcott for most of her adult life. She'd come to Harlan's Ford in 1868, about 3 years after the war ended, to help her Aunt Cecile run the boarding house when Cecile's health started failing. She was 29 by then, and she had a way of carrying herself that most people in town misread as coldness, but that I'd come to understand was something more like self-containment. A woman who had decided, for reasons she kept private, that she was going to manage her own life and not require anyone to manage it for her. She was good at it. She was better than good. When Cecile died in 1872 and left her the property, Nora had it running clean and profitable inside a year. She kept the books herself. She did her own hiring. She fixed her own roof when a branch came down in a spring storm and took a section of shingles off. She had friends in town, me Gruder at the dry goods, Pastor Lynn's wife, and she was warm with them, and she wasn't unfriendly to anyone, but she kept a distance that people had mostly stopped trying to cross. Men had tried. That much I could tell you from observation, because Harlan's Ford was a small town and you noticed things. A freighter named Colby had shown an interest around 1874. A cattle buyer who passed through regular had made a more serious case of it around 1876. Nora had been polite and final with both of them, and after a while people stopped trying, and Nora went on running her boarding house with the same quiet competence she'd always had, and nobody talked about it much. I had wondered over the years. I had thought about Calvin Reese, whose name I hadn't heard spoken in Harlan's Ford in a long time, and about the way Nora sometimes looked out the window of an evening with an expression that was too still to be contentment. I had wondered what she was waiting for, or whether she had stopped waiting and just wasn't done carrying it yet. I hadn't asked, it wasn't my business, but I'd wondered. On the 4th day, I went to settle some paperwork at the office of the late Heck Varney. Heck had been the postmaster in Harlan's Ford from 1858 until his death the previous June, nearly 30 years in the job. He died without family, intestate, and the town council had appointed me to inventory his personal property and arrange for the sale of his effects, since I was the senior law officer, and there was nobody else suitable for the job. It was the kind of task that sounds simple and turns out to be the opposite, because Heck Varney had been a man who kept everything. His back room was full of boxes, ledgers going back to the territorial days, old catalogs, a collection of pocket watches in various states of disrepair, fishing tackle, 3 pairs of boots in sizes that didn't seem to match anyone Heck's general dimensions. I had been working through it in chunks for 4 months, an hour or 2 at a time when I had nothing more pressing, and I had catalogued most of it and arranged for most of it to be sold. And what was left, on the morning I'm describing, was a section of the back wall that was half hidden behind a wardrobe I'd been putting off moving because it was heavy and I was 53 years old and my back knew it. I moved it that morning, got my shoulder under the corner and shifted it out from the wall, and behind it were 2 things, a loose board in the plaster and an old steamer trunk. The trunk was locked. I found the key in the toe of one of the unmatched boots, which was the kind of hiding place that only made sense to a man who expected to be the only one looking. Inside the trunk were letters. A great many letters, bundled with string, stacked in careful rows, organized by year. I could see the dates on the topmost envelopes of each bundle. The earliest were from 1861, the most recent from 1869. 8 years of correspondence, all of it addressed in the same hand to the same person. Miss Nora Whitfield, Harlan's Ford. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long time. Then I closed the trunk, locked it, put the key in my vest pocket and went to find Calvin Reese. He was at the land office when I found him, signing the last of the transfer paperwork on his father's acreage. I waited outside on the boardwalk until he came out, and when he did I didn't say anything, just tipped my head toward the alley between the land office and the milliner's, somewhere quieter. He followed me, looked at my face and went still. "What is it?" he said. "I need you to come with me," I said. "There's something you need to see." I won't say he was a man who showed his feelings easily, because he wasn't. Calvin Reese had always been like that. You could read him if you knew him, but only just, and only if you were paying attention. But when I showed him the trunk and lifted the lid and let him see what was inside, I watched something happen in his face that I had never seen there before. Not in all the years I'd known him. Not in the war, not after. Something cracked open, slow and terrible, like a seam giving way under pressure that had been building for a very long time. He reached into the trunk and picked up one of the bundles, looked at the string, set it down without untying it. "He kept them," Calvin said. The words came out flat. 20 years he just kept them. "Looks like it." "Why?" I had thought about that on the walk over. Heck Varney had been a man I'd known my whole life, and I was ashamed to say I had never thought to look at him closely enough to answer that question with any certainty. He'd been a small, precise man, unmarried, meticulous in his professional life, and sealed up tight in his personal one. He might have wanted Nora for himself. That was the obvious answer, the one the surface of the thing suggested. Or he might have been the kind of man who derived a quiet, terrible satisfaction from the simple exercise of that kind of power, from knowing something nobody else knew, from holding something that mattered and choosing not to let it go. Those kinds of men existed. They were not rare. "I don't know," I said. "He's dead. We can't ask him." Calvin stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "How many?" I had counted while I waited. 211, I said, "give or take." He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the trunk again. Then he said very quietly, "She thought I stopped writing." "Yes," I said. "That would be what she thought." "She thought I just," he stopped, started again. "She would have thought I decided she wasn't worth the trouble." "Calvin." 20 years, he said. "She spent 20 years thinking I walked away and didn't look back." "Yes." He stood very still for a moment. Then he crouched down in front of the trunk and he picked up the first bundle, the ones from 1861, and held them in his hands, and I looked away, because some things a man is entitled to have in private. We carried the trunk to my office, and I locked it there while we decided what to do. What to do seemed clear to me, but I was aware it wasn't my decision. The letters were Calvin's, he'd written them. Nora's name was on them, but they'd never reached her, and that made the whole question thornier than it looked, because you couldn't simply walk up to a woman and hand her 20 years of correspondence from a man she'd closed a chapter on and expect it to be straightforward. "I want her to have them," Calvin said. "I'm not asking her to do anything with them. I just want her to know." "Know what?" "That I didn't stop." He said it simply, without drama. "That I wrote until I thought she'd moved on, and then I stopped because I thought it was kinder to stop. But I never stopped because I wanted to." He looked at the trunk. "She deserves to know that." "And after," I said, "what do you want after?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "I don't think it matters what I want. That's her call to make, not mine." I thought about that, about the way he'd said it, not with resignation exactly, but with a kind of hard-won honesty, the kind that comes from a man who has thought something through completely and arrived at the truth of it even when the truth wasn't easy. "All right," I said, "then let's figure out how to give them to her." We decided I would do it. Calvin's reasoning was that Nora had a right to the letters and to the knowledge of what Heck Varney had done, regardless of anything else, regardless of whether Calvin was in Harlan's Ford or not, regardless of what she felt about him, regardless of what came next. The letters were evidence of something that had been done to her, a theft of something she should have had, and she deserved to have them returned, and the truth explained by someone she trusted who wasn't Calvin Reese. I went to the boarding house that evening after supper. Nora was in the sitting room with her account books, and she looked up when I knocked on the door frame, and I asked if I could sit down, and she said yes. I told her what I'd found. I told her about the trunk and the key in the boot and the 211 letters. I told her the dates. I told her whose name was on all of them. She was very still while I talked. She had a way of going still that I'd noticed before, not frozen, not absent, but fully present in the stillness, like a person gathering something in before it got away from them. When I stopped talking, she said, "He kept them for 20 years. "Yes." "Heck Varney." "Yes." She looked at the account book in her lap. She had her finger on a column of figures she'd been adding up when I came in, and I noticed she didn't move the finger, as if her hand had simply forgotten what it was doing and gone quiet. "Calvin wrote to me," she said, "not a question." 211 letters, I said. "From 1861 to 1869. He stopped when your replies stopped coming back to him. He assumed you'd moved on." "I never wrote him back after 1862, she said slowly. "Because his letters stopped coming." "His letters never stopped," I said. "They stopped reaching you." She sat with that for a moment. I watched her work through it, the arithmetic of it, the architecture of a lie built out of nothing more than a man's ability to intercept and withhold. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the slow, terrible math of what 8 years of letters, hidden in a trunk, had cost 2 people. "He's still in town," I said. "Calvin, he's not asking for anything. He wanted you to have the letters, that's all." She looked up at me. Her eyes were dark and very clear. "Does he know you're here?" "Yes." "Does he know what you're telling me?" "He asked me to tell you." She nodded once, looked back down at the account book. "Thank you, DeLand," she said, in a voice that was steady and quiet. "I'd like to be alone now." I went. The trunk was delivered to the boarding house the following morning, before Calvin was up. I had one of the young men from the livery carry it. Nora received it at the back door without comment and had it taken up to her room. Calvin came down for breakfast and I watched him see the space where the trunk had been in my office, and he didn't say anything. We had coffee together at my desk. He was quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet than it had been before, not the held-back, wound-up quiet of a man carrying something unresolved, but something more open and emptied out. A man waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. "She knows," I said. "I know," he said. "Thank you. What are you going to do?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Finish what I came here to do," he said. "The land agent needs one more signature." Then he paused. "I don't know. I thought I'd ride out once the paperwork was done." But he stopped again. "But I don't want to," he said. "I've wanted to not leave this town again since approximately 5 minutes after I arrived." I looked at him. "Then don't." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," I said. "The complicated part happened already. Somebody hid your letters in a trunk for 20 years and now she has them. Everything else is simple." He looked at me for a moment. Then a corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the memory of one, the shape of what it would be if he let it. "You were always a straightforward man, DeLand," he said. "I was a deputy for 30 years, I said. "I don't have the patience for complicated." He drank his coffee. "Nora read the letters across 3 nights. I know this not because I was privy to it directly, but because Gruder told me, who had it from Pastor Lynn's wife, who lived 2 doors down from the boarding house, and had seen the lamp burning in Nora's window late on 3 consecutive evenings. Small towns keep their own accounting of things. I didn't see Nora during those 3 days. I saw Calvin. He moved through his remaining tasks in Harlan's Ford with the deliberate patience of a man who had decided to stay until something resolved itself, one way or the other. He ate his meals at the boarding house. He repaired a section of fence on the north side of his father's old property, which didn't need doing given that he just sold the land. But he did it anyway, and I thought I understood why. A man has to do something with his hands when he's waiting, and the fence needed fixing, and the new owner would benefit from it, and that was enough reason. He didn't push, he didn't seek Nora out. He gave her the room she needed, which told me something about who he'd become in 20 years, or maybe who he'd always been, underneath the younger impatience of the man I'd ridden out with in the spring of 1861. On the 4th morning, Nora came to find him. I didn't see it happen. I learned about it afterward, pieced together from what Calvin told me and what I could read in both their faces when I saw them later that day. But I've thought about it enough times that I can see it clearly in my mind, the way it must have looked, the 2 of them at the fence line south of the boarding house where the property gave onto the open range. She came in the early morning, before the town was properly awake, wearing her gray wool coat and her plain boots, her hair put up simply. Calvin was at the fence checking the repair he'd made. He heard her coming, a man who'd spent 20 years ranging country learns to hear things, and he turned and he saw her and he went still. She stopped a few feet away. She had one of his letters in her hand, not a bundle, just one, a single letter, folded and refolded until the creases had softened. He recognized it, he told me later. It was the one from the winter of 1863, the one he'd written from a field camp in Virginia when he was sick with fever and not entirely certain he'd make it through, when he'd written things he'd never have put on paper in a clearer moment. He had forgotten he'd sent it. He had certainly never expected her to find it and carry it back to him. She held it for a moment. Then she said, "You wrote that you were afraid you'd never see this town again." "I was afraid of that," he said. "You wrote that the thing you were most afraid of losing wasn't your life," she said. "You wrote that it was the possibility of coming home." He was quiet. "I read all of them," she said, "all 211. "Nora." "Don't," she said, not harshly, more like she was setting something down that was too heavy to keep holding. "Let me finish." He let her finish. I spent 20 years believing you decided I wasn't enough to come back for, she said. I built everything I have out of that. I told myself I was fine. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself a great many things. She looked at the letter in her hand. Most of them were lies. I'm not very good at lying to myself, so they never quite took. I know, he said. You can't know. I know because I told myself the same things, he said, about you. She looked up at him. He looked at her. The morning was pale and cold and wide open the way the high plains are in October, the sky a thin blue with the sun just clearing the ridgeline to the east, and everything very quiet. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I brought the letters back because you had a right to them. That's all I wanted for you to know that I wrote, that I didn't stop because I wanted to. I know that now, she said. Then that's enough, he said. Whatever you need, that's enough. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the range and lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, and she reached up and moved it back without thinking about it. And he watched her do it with an expression I can only describe as a man remembering something he thought he'd finished missing. It's not enough, she said. He looked at her. 20 years is a long time, she said. We're not the same people we were. I'm not going to pretend we are. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. But I'd like to know who you are now, Calvin Reese, if you're staying. He was very still for a moment. Then, I'm staying. Good, she said. She turned and walked back toward the boarding house. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. He didn't ride out on the Keeler Road. He took a room at the boarding house formally, paid in advance for a month, and he began to look for work in Harlan's Ford and the surrounding range. He wasn't a young man anymore, and he wasn't a man with a great deal of money, but he knew cattle and he knew country, and there was always use for a man like that. He hired on with a rancher named Sutter who ran a spread about 6 miles east of town. Honest work, hard work, the kind that keeps a man's hands busy and gives him something to come back from in the evenings. He and Nora were slow and careful with each other. I watched it happen over the following weeks. Or rather, I caught the edges of it, the way you catch the edges of things in a small town where you're not exactly looking but not exactly not looking either. They talked in the evenings when he came back from Sutter's place, sometimes at the table after supper, sometimes on the porch when the weather wasn't too cold. He helped her with things around the boarding house without being asked, and without making a production of it, fixed the hinge on the root cellar door, recaulked a window that had been letting the cold in, split a winter's worth of stove wood over 2 Sundays. She fed him well and kept his room clean, and didn't soften her manner toward him in any obvious way. But it was a different quality of neutral than it had been the first week, warmer in the way that rooms warm when a fire's been burning in them long enough that the walls start holding the heat. They were building something, the way you build something when you've done it wrong the first time and know you can't afford to do it wrong again. Carefully, piece by piece, testing each piece before you put weight on it. I stayed out of it. I'd done my part. The trunk had been found and the truth had been told, and now it was between the two of them. Though I'll admit I was not sorry when, on a cold evening in late November, Gruder came into my office with a look on her face and said, "Did you know Nora Alcott is allowing Calvin Reese to walk her to church?" I said I had not known that. "Well," me said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose town has done something right for once, "she is." They married in the spring. It was a plain ceremony, the way Nora would have wanted it, Pastor Lind, the sitting room of the boarding house, maybe 15 people. Gruder cried. I did not cry because I was a deputy and deputies do not cry at weddings, but I will say that my eyes were not entirely dry and I will leave it at that. Calvin wore the best coat he owned, which wasn't remarkable, and Nora wore a dress the color of cream wool with a spray of dried wildflowers at her collar. And she looked, I searched for the right word then, and I search for it now. She looked like a woman who had set something down that she'd been carrying a very long time, and found, to her surprise, that her hands were free. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he'd been certain was lost. There was no reception to speak of. Nora put out bread and cold beef, and a good cake she'd made herself, and people stood around and ate and talked, and were cheerful in the unpolished way of people who are genuinely glad. Calvin's hand found hers at some point and didn't let go of it, and I watched her look down at their joined hands with an expression I couldn't name and didn't need to. They moved into the old Reese property south of town the following month. Nora kept the boarding house, put a competent woman named Dora Fitch in charge of the day-to-day, and went out to the property with Calvin on the weekends to begin the work of making it livable. He was up before dawn every day, working Sutter's ranch during the week, working his own property on the weekends, building the kind of life you build with your hands when you know what it cost you not to have it. I rode out there one afternoon in June, just to see how it was going. The old house was half repaired, new shingles on half the roof, fresh whitewash on the porch boards, the kitchen garden Nora had put in showing green at the south side of the house. Calvin was replacing boards on the barn floor, and Nora was at the pump with a bucket, and she looked up when she heard my horse and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, and she smiled, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there, and called out, "DeLand, you'll stay for supper." It wasn't a question. I stayed for supper. I am an old man now, and I have seen a fair number of things in this life that I was glad to see, and a fair number that I was not, and I've learned to be honest about which is which. The thing I'm most glad I saw, more than I expected to be, when I started thinking back through it, is what happened when I moved that wardrobe in Heck Varney's back room. Not the trunk, not the letters exactly, though the letters mattered. What I'm glad I saw is what came after. Two people who had good reason to have given up a long time ago and hadn't quite managed to, who got the truth handed back to them late and made something of it anyway. There's a stubbornness to that kind of love that I find I respect more than I once did. The kind that doesn't know it's been stubborn, that just kept a lamp in the window out of some habit of the heart it couldn't quite break. Calvin Reese rode back into Harlan's Ford meaning to sign some papers and ride back out. He rode back because he couldn't not. Because 20 years of telling himself he understood why she'd gone quiet hadn't fully taken, and some part of him had never stopped hoping the equation was wrong. He was right to hope the equation was wrong. The letters were in a trunk behind a wardrobe, and the woman they were addressed to had never stopped keeping a light on in her window at night, though she'd never have said so, and neither would I, except that I was the one who found the trunk and now I'm the one telling it, and a man who finds a trunk like that owes it to somebody to say what he knows. The fence he repaired on his father's old property is still standing. So are they.